Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our daily journey throughout the entire Talmud. We are studying the whole Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And presently, we're studying Masechet Shabbos. We are on Tzadik Tes Amud Beis. That's 99b. And in just a moment, we're going to jump over into page Kuf 100 of the Talmud, which, if you ask Mark, on one hand, it's really 200 pages. On the other hand, it's 198 pages. Either way, it's a milestone. And I think Kuf is worthy of celebration. Today is Monday, the 24th of January, the 22nd of Shvat. Before we start, I'm going to dedicate our learning for the well-being, health, and prosperity of the dear members of our Chabura, as well as the good health and speedy healing for any of the family members of our dear members of the Chabura that may so need, and of course, in prayer for wishes, for good news for all of Klal Yisrael. We'll also mention Refuah Shlema for Elise Bas Ada. And I want to mention, unfortunately, yesterday, Sunday, we didn't have a shir, but it was my mother's yard site, so I want to mention her name as well. We'll learn today, Lili Nishmasa, Chasi Bastavia, and it's her 8th yard site. It was her 8th yard site. And I honored her in the way that I think she would want to be honored. I tried to give my wife a little bit, I took the kids, and so knowing my mother, she would have had a lot of nachas of that. But today we'll dedicate our learning for her yard site as well. And I also want to mention that today, Chaf Beis Shvat, is the yard site of the Rebbetzin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbetzin Chaim Mushke, who was the daughter of the Rayatz, the daughter of the previous Rebbe. She passed away in 1988 on the 22nd of Shvat. And she was a remarkable woman. Again, I was only one years old or so I couldn't tell you much about her. But one of the interesting things about her is that she was exceedingly modest, and considering the Rebbe's profile, she was very strongly, and her father's high profile, she took great efforts to really remain out of the public eye. And many Hasidim only appreciated the extent of her influence and her chachma. I mean, those that knew, but those who didn't, she didn't go to a public farbrengen very much. Many were able to realize and learned a lot about her influence only after her passing. And she was a big pikeach, a very wise person, and also had a lot of worldly wisdom, and she was a clever person and an educated person, and a balas chesed. But again,
Rabbi, didn't she have an architectural degree?
I don't know exactly. She was highly educated along with her husband, and she also was possibly a, how do you call it, she authored works but not in her name, or she was involved in editing different works but without using her name. So she was possibly a ghostwriter and other things. And I mean, there's a lot of stories, but it was only the Meshamshim and the people that knew her. But there's one story I just saw, and then we'll get into the Gemara, where she was driving with someone who would drive her. This is in her later years, and she needed fresh air. And so one of the Gaboyim was driving her, and the road was blocked off. And so they took a detour, and they drive past. This is a famous story. And she drives past another street, and they see the sheriffs are unloading furniture, and a family's being evicted. And she tells the shamish, the misharis, to pull a boat over and see what's going on. And they find out that they were being evicted. They couldn't pay the rent. And so she asked them to find out. And she wrote a personal check to pay. I think they may have been African-American. I don't think they were Jewish or anything, but she wrote a check, and it was able to put them back in the house. And the mishamish asked her, like, why did you think to stop? And she said, listen, the Hasidic teachings tell us that everything is by divine providence, hashgacha pratis. Every day we go a certain way. And of all days, today we took a detour, we passed by. So to me, there was no suffix that it was her mitzvah to do. It was her opportunity to save them. And so it's an interesting combination of course, the chesed, but also understanding. And when you see something, you can't turn a blind eye, but you have to act. And anyway, so that's the story. Zechusa, Yagan Aleino, her merit should be a zechus for Klal Yisrael. And following her passing, they established that weekend of her passing should be the annual conference of shluchot, of the co-directors of the Chabad houses that are that daven in the Ezras Noshim, the Rebbitzins, and in Chabad, the Rebbe didn't want them to be like secondary, or a Rebbitzin many times just means that they're married to the rabbi, but in Chabad and in our shul, in our community as well, the Rebbe wanted that, and it makes sense, and it's also effective that the Rebbitzins should be full-fledged directors of the work that happens. And again, that conference is in her honor, and you find it very fascinating. My wife couldn't go this year, but they have access to some of the sessions and the discussions, and these are really power women doing a lot of great things for Klal Yisrael. And so, anyways, a tribute to the Rebbitzin Chaim Mushka. And let's learn some Gemara now. Let's turn the page. Let's get into page 100. While we load, I welcome any comments or questions, but just want to get started here. Reb Beryl, you were saying something? Oh, you mentioned about the degree. All right, so just to remind y'all, a very interesting discussion in the Gemara that we finished yesterday, well, not yesterday, on Friday, which was the question about when the act of hanocha, of placement, or the act of akira, uplifting, uprooting the item, picking it up, simultaneously changes the status of the place from which the item has been taken or from which the item has been placed. And again, it's hard for us to if someone would have just said that in the abstract, we would have probably had a hard time conceiving of the scenario. But the Gemara was kind to us, and the Gemara actually describes us. What happens if you scoop out a handful of earth from a place that was once only 9 tfachim deep, and therefore is not considered its own rishus hayachid? It's part of the public domain. Granted, that would be a miserable pothole to deal with. But what happens if in the moment that you scoop up the earth, at that very moment, the hole now is a 10 tefach hole, and now it would become its own domain? Or conversely, what happens if you take a scoop of earth, you pick it up from the ground, and you deposit it into a bar, into a pit, into a hole that's 10 tefachim, but by the time whatever you scooped hits the ground, you have now diminished the depth of the pit to be only 9 tefachim? Do we say that both events, the placement and the new height, is simultaneous and you are exempt? Or do we say, I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. Realize that there's an important distinction. In the scenario where you scooped out the earth, if it's not simultaneous, you are exempt. If it only becomes 10 tefachim after you scooped it out, it means that you've essentially removed the earth from a 9 tefach pit. Conversely, when you place it back, if it is simultaneous, you would be exempt because you only placed it into a 9 tefach hole. Whereas if there's a gap, if there's a lapse in between, then you would be chayiv. So, anyways, that was the Gemara's question. The Gemara attempted to bring a very interesting instance where you throw something at a wall, and we're talking about the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says a thing that is sticky, so it doesn't drop or fall; it stays suspended in the air. And we ask, why are you chayiv? Perhaps the wall becomes diminished. And we answer that there's a strong distinction between adding a clump. Bottom line, there's a big distinction between adding earth to a pit, which now becomes entirely subsumed and part of the pit, and when you throw a cake of figs, or if it was a more modern discussion, if you threw some spaghetti at the wall, it doesn't become part of the wall. It still remains a separate entity, and it can be removed, and it could be consumed, and it has its own title. It doesn't lose its name, whereas a little mud or concrete or cement on a wall, it just becomes part of the wall. So therefore, we didn't have a perfect analogy, and the Gemara seemingly leaves off without really resolving this question. Before we go on, and we will go on, let's do this. Let's see if there's any. Let's see the Rambam. This Rambam. Bar Tisha Rishus Rabim. You have a pit. This is our story, and it's 9 tefachim deep, which does not make it a Rishus Hayachid. It's considered a Rishus Rabim. Va'akar chulya mikarki isoi, and you scooped out earth. V'ishlimul asar, and now it is 10 tefachim deep. Afalpi shakira sachefetz v'asiyas amechitza boin ka'achas. Although at the same moment that you scoop out the earth, it now becomes a separate domain. Patur, One is exempt. Because it wasn't the scenario when you started the uprooting. Now, what if it was the opposite case, also the Argamar's case? The pit was 10 tvachim deep. It was its own domain. And then you threw in earth and now it becomes diminished. Potter. So we will use the simultaneous nature of the events as the Rambam, and this is the sense that you might get from the Gemara to be exempt, but it's not enough to make you chayiv. There's a lot of scholarship to understand exactly why that is, but I just wanted to at least show you how this is introduced.
Is there a problem with it taking dirt out or putting dirt in on Shabbos?
There may be other issues. There may be other issues associated with this event, but not the issue of carrying. And again, it's another discussion. Is it compact earth? Is it not? But suffice it to say, for the purposes of Eitzah, the Rambam Paskins and the Gemara leaves us with a little bit of a doubt, but ultimately, it's the Rambam Paskins that you're exempt. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Is there an issue of a nolad here? Because now we have a new entity that didn't exist before, like an entity that is basically, it was a public domain and that it became a private, and vice versa.
Professor, I don't have an answer for you, but it is an interesting question. It is an interesting question.
Like digging this or putting the earth is a process of making.
It's in other words.
Before.
So, Professor, we have a few questions here. Your line of questioning is perfect. Suppose I'm just explaining back what you're saying. Suppose we've established that for the purposes of Haitza'ah, you have not transferred an item from one domain to a different domain because it's the same domain. In both scenarios, we're perceiving the pit as a Rishus Harabim. Either when you took it out, it was a Rishus Harabim and only became a Rishus Yachid afterwards, or the restoring the earth to the pit, although it happens at the same moment, it is no longer a separate domain because the earth made it a Rishus Yachid. That is what we said. But you're asking a fantastic question, which is there are other factors that need to be considered. One question, do you use the word noiled? It's a new or boina. You're creating a new entity. And so is that a problem? Are there other aspects of digging that are potentially prohibited? I think boina would be the main thing. And so I don't have the tools right now to give you the full thought process. Probably what we're going to say is that ultimately, what is the constructive value? I'm just thinking aloud with you. What is the functional distinction? I know there's a very strong halachic distinction. But what is the functional distinction between the pit when it was 9 tfachim and 10 tfachim? Is there a functional evolution, or is it purely halachic? And then you'll wonder, if so, why do we make 10 tfachim? If it isn't functional, then what's the significance of 10 tfachim? Okay, I just want to show you here. Professor, it's not, hold on, Professor, this is not answering your question per se, but just to acknowledge here, the Maggid Mishnah acknowledges that this was a baya de la ifshita. It was a question that remained unaddressed, unresolved. The Rambam generally says the Maggid Mishnah, and this is a common understanding of the Rambam's viewpoint, is always inclined to go on to say that you're potter in these areas of a suffix.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Why is it not a consideration of how likely something is to happen? You know, there's a big difference when you throw something and chances are it's going to go a certain distance. And if it's obvious going to go there, whether it does or it doesn't, it should be important also how possible it is.
Well, Kavana.
Correct. If your intention is to do well, then that's really what matters. The commonality of an event, it doesn't seem to have a lot of bearing on the, or at the very least, as the doctor says, we're more interested in the person's intent by a long shot than the prevalence of the event. Certainly when it comes to laws of Shabbos.
There's something that I wanted to ask.
I'll go ahead, Alan, please.
You mentioned before that if you threw a lump of plaster on the wall,
Mhm.
it became part of the wall. But it really isn't, because it's an ugly piece that's sticking out, protruding from the wall. It's like a bump on the wall. So you're going to eventually scrape it off. So if it's not permanent, is it still okay?
Here, the question, ironically, wasn't really about okay. It was just a question of if we look at the distance that it traveled. For the own limit of my attention and concentration today, this is an important angle to consider, but I'm gonna defer for now because we have to really go back and revisit and think through the specifics of the question and what exactly the implications were. Because the idea was that if the wall became thicker, well, then it didn't land. You see, I'm doing what I said I'm not going to do. But if the wall became thicker, so then by extension, the item landed just short of a precise 4 amma space. And so the question wasn't if you're ever going to remove it. But surely, Alan, you'll agree with me, and I'll just leave with this, that there's a distinction between an ugly clump of cement or whatever other building material on a wall and a fig or a piece of spaghetti, which maybe you'll shave it off, maybe you'll trim it. Also, Alan, have you been to Israel? Have you seen some of the ancient walls? They didn't have the same smooth facade and the value of the smooth facade as we have today. So it's not certain that they would remove it. And maybe there was, anyways, so your question is a good one. We can go deep on that, but let's leave it at that for now. There's even if you would remove it eventually, there's certainly no comparison between a food item and a building and an item of construction or building. So again, that's the cheap answer.
Thank you.
All right. Let us now go on to a new question, and this question, with Hashem's help, will move us on to page 100. A new question, similar idea. And my dear friends, have no fear. I downloaded a new PDF so we can continue to make use of these wonderful resources and so stand by. Boya Rava asked the question. Zora Kadaf. You have a board, V'nach al gaba yeseidos, and it landed on top of posts or stakes. Mahu, what is the halacha? Now hold on. Without any explanation, we would be entirely lost over here. So let's take a look at Rashi. Yeseidos takas, you have these thin posts. Shayu gavoyos asara, they were 10 tfachim tall or more. Ve'ein rechavos dalid, but they are super narrow. Vidaf ze rochav dalid, and this piece of wood has 4 tfachim of width. And so what happens is that when this piece of wood lands on top of the wood posts, a magical event happens. This board now creates a new Rishus HaYachid. Aso Rishus HaYachid. So what's the question? Again, Zorak dafenachal gabi yeseidos, you throw this piece of wood and it lands on the posts. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, hold on, what's the halacha? What's the question? Here's the question. Hanachas chayfetz, v'asiyas mechitza, when the item lands. And at that very moment, we create a new domain, v'hade hadadi, simultaneously. That's our question. Because again, the thing that you transported was the top. What did it land on? It didn't land on a Rishus HaYachid. It landed ostensibly on something that would probably be classified as a Makam P'tur. But when it landed, it created a Rishus HaYachid. So do we say, oh, wow, you threw the item and it landed in a place that's a Rishus HaYachid because now it's a Rishus HaYachid? Or do we say, no, it landed on a Makom P'tur and then it was turned into Rishus HaYachid? I hope I explained it accurately. Rashi, Mahul is Chayiv is Rikazu. Was this act of throwing prohibited? Let's make use of our visual aids over here. No, wrong one. Here we go. And we'll see based on the Gemara's elaboration, perhaps there should be a loaf of bread on top of it or not, but let's just, he's throwing a board and it lands on posts. It's a piece of wood and it lands on the four legs that was once a table. The moment it lands, you have a Rishus HaYachid. And so this is the Gemara's question. Don't look at all the words because that's going to be soon. But you got to give it, you got to admire this elderly rabbi with a beard and a gartel. And he has incredible aim. He has such precision. He could throw that board for 4 amas.
And he's left-handed.
Actually, it doesn't need to be 4 amas. You're right, because it's Haitzah. But yeah, you got to give him some credit. This guy is he probably played for the NBA in his youth. But all right, let's go back to the Gemara for a moment. So the Gemara says, hold on. Hainu, the Rabbi Yochanan. Isn't this a familiar question? Isn't this what Rabbi Yochanan asked earlier? If the earth lands in the hole and now it becomes less than 10 tefachim, or he scooped out the earth and it became a Rishus HaYachid, it's just another scenario with the same set of facts. It's the same idea. The creation of a Rishus HaYachid happens with the moment that the item that you threw landed. Isn't it the same idea? Hainu de Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says no. We have a little bit of an added wrinkle that makes this distinct and a part of Rabbi Yochanan's question. Excuse me. Ki Rava. When did Rava have a question? Only in the following scenario. Ki going to Zorak Daf. Now he's really impressive. He didn't just manage to throw a board to land on the post precisely so, but it was actually had a item piggybacking on top of it. And in the picture, he draws a challah, a piece of a loaf of bread. So now here's the question. You throw a board and it landed on posts. The board had the dimensions to turn those posts, those obscure nothings, into a Rishus HaYachid. What is the halacha? Kivan de bahadi hadadi ka'asu, being that they landed simultaneously. Is it like Rabbi Yochanan's situation, where we created a new zone with its landing, and therefore you should be exempt? But there's an alternate understanding. Kivan deloy efshar, deloy midlei purta v'hadi noich. Try throwing something with something on top of it, and when it lands, what happens? There's a bump. And at the moment of the bump, the item lifts up just a tad, just a drop. And so can you say that simultaneous with the landing of the daf is the landing of the object? No. There's got to be that momentary gap, that little lapse, that little second when the item jumps. Now it lands. And then you should be chayiv, because where did it land? It landed on a Rishus HaYachid. Again, kivan delay efshar delay midli porta. It's as if first you made the new domain, then you placed it down, and you should be chayiv. And the Gemara answers off with the exciting and frustrating answer: Teiku. Elijah the prophet one day will have the answer, but for now it remains an unresolved query. Let's see some Rashis. The loaf of bread in the picture that's piggybacking on the board. It's going to have a little bit of a momentary lapse. If we could have one of those cameras that catch every millisecond, we would catch a little picture of that bread with a little, or that item with a little gap, and then it lands a frame later. And so therefore, perhaps it's considered Akira and Hanacha. Akasias mechitza. Reisha, first you make the domain. V'hadar hanachatz achefetz, and only afterwards the item is placed down. And therefore, chayv b'shas hanachasai, kfarnasas daf Rishus HaYachid. So essentially what happened is the loaf of bread was picked up on a daf, and it was catapulted through the air from a Rishus Harabim. And it looked like it was going to land in another Rishus Harabim. And we're going to have to say that it was less than 4 amas. But then the board landed, and a millisecond later, the bread landed. But that wasn't enough. Maybe it landed now. It went from a Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid. Ironically, or interestingly, the Gemara doesn't give an answer. The Gemara leaves us off with a question. Personally, I don't know if you feel the same. I feel an affinity with the second possibility. That is interesting. It probably does land on top of a Rishus Yachid. So why doesn't the Gemara give an answer? I don't know. It's something we need to think about. Something we need to ponder. Any thoughts?
So,
Rabbi, my thoughts are way out, but somehow it makes sense to me. I'm thinking about batel b'shishim. You're making a soup, and you have this treif ingredient, and you put it in, and you're halfway done making the soup, and so it's treif. Okay, but you continue then, and you come to a point where you become aware that it's not a kosher ingredient. So the question is now, and you finished making it. Okay, so 5 minutes ago, you had a treif soup, and now you added to it, but it's kosher because it's less than the amount that you need. But you added to a treif soup that was, so to me, somehow I'm thinking about that kind of analogy. I don't know.
You're
Rabbi,
saying that you're saying the minuscule moment is kind of like the minuscule item that's batel b'shishim. It's so invisible. We don't expect you to take I'm thinking through what you're saying. It's interesting. You're saying halacha doesn't mandate that we take a camera that can take 60 frames a second so that we could identify that little momentary lapse of a millisecond where the item was airborne and landed. We look at what we see, and what the eye sees is that concurrent or alongside with the landing of the board, the chayfetz landed. It's not 2 events, and therefore we're not expected to push the limit of human capacity. And you might say, and it's a big topic, so I'm not weighing halachically, there's a question about microscopic, right, organisms. Do you have to search for microscopic organisms, or does the Torah expect us to use our eyes and use our ears and use our senses and use that in determination? And so,
Rabbi.
Doctor, it's quite. I'm sorry. So it's quite possible, Doctor, that you're making a fair point. The event that we have to theorize but can't actually capture with the naked eye, and it's not evident. Maybe halacha doesn't expect us to parse reality at such a level, and maybe for that reason the Gemara is not comfortable taking the second viewpoint, but the Gemara is not comfortable saying it's okay. The Gemara leaves it as a teku, but maybe because of the complexity and maybe that's why. Very interesting, and I'll take it. Reb Beryl.
Rabbi, on a philosophical level, what's happening is something is landing on what it itself created. So therefore, it's like the chicken and the egg. It has to create it before it lands philosophically.
You're saying you cannot land on top of something unless there's something to
You're
land on.
creating the problem by landing.
So you're saying conceptually there are 2 stages.
Mm-hmm.
Reality, there's one event. That one event has two stories. And by the way, a lot of times something happens and you have 2 witnesses and they see 2 different stories, but it's not because they didn't see the same thing. It's because their brains process different angles of the event. So you're saying that here too, you could have 2 Torah scholars or not Torah scholars say, what did you just see? And one guy said, I saw a guy throw a frisbee and it landed. I said, no, I saw the creation of a new rishus. What happened? They both happened. But you're saying philosophically and conceptually, it's 2 different events. And therefore, you're inclined to say that you should be chayiv, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question. going back to the soup
Yeah.
sample, the story.
Okay, sorry,
let's-
guys. It's Monday. I apologize.
A barrel?
So let me ask you a question about the soup. So you have, and I think Bernie touched on it. You have a soup, fleshika soup, a drop of milk drops in. So batel b'shishim. But then let's assume that the amount of milk that dropped is more than a 60th. So it renders it treif. Now you come and you add to that soup the kosher ingredient, more water or more whatever, and now it becomes a 60th or less. Or batel. So is it now batel b'shishim, even though it was treif, and now you render it? It's like adding sand or whatever to the whole,
Right.
and make it 9 tefachim from the 10 tefachim.
So I'll tell
I
you this,
think that
there's a
was-
principle that says, en mivatlin isor lechatchila. You are not allowed to intentionally engage in the process of diluting non-kosher.
Okay, so why
So-
can't we add? So why can't we add
So you're saying this is like,
to the 10 tefachim, make it into 9 tefachim?
so what you're saying is just like one is not allowed to intentionally dilute a non-kosher item. Well, here, I'll tell you why, because the analogy is not perfect. It's great, but it's not perfect. It's good for us to understand that we're not expected to, that the Torah is reasonable and the halacha takes the human experience into account. The reason why it's different is because when it comes to kosher, what's shishim? Shishim is the amount that a normal person would be able to notice a taste or not notice a taste. And because the prohibition of kashrus is mostly about tam and about flavor, so if the item doesn't contribute any tam, so it's bottom. But once it's there, you're not allowed to intentionally kosherize it by adding other food. Here, it's the same that it's minuscule, and it's the same that you might not notice it, or it's possibly the same, but it's not quite the very same. The factors are not identical. Here was more a question of, can we capture that moment or not? And again, it was a theory. It was a perspective. So I don't know if that addresses it. That's just a stream of consciousness.
Rabbi?
Yes, doctor.
Another analogy. A plane touches down, right? You're going to go on a plane, it touches down. They say the plane has landed, but it's still moving. And then it stops moving, but they still have the motor on. So now we have the challah on the piece of wood, and we're talking about it. It landed. Yes, it did touch. They touched at the same time, and you're saying, oh, but it jumped up a millil, whatever, smallest amount, and then it came down again. Right. But what if the whole thing? You have these 4 posts there, or whatever. What if they're not of even size? Is there movement? You can start talking about landed. Nah, it's not moving. Supposedly.
Hold on, I just did something with my headphones. I'm sorry, hang on. I hear you. Sorry. Doctor, go ahead.
No, I mean, the question is what we mean by nach landed. Is it lands,
right? And if we get into the physics of it,
yeah,
you could be stationary, but there's
right. So that's what I'm saying.
Right,
the motor and the motor in the plane is still going. You're unload whatever. It didn't stop working. So
Doctor, put it in different words, Doctor. If the item that was on top of the board was Jello,
yeah,
even after it landed, you would be able to visualize
exactly
the
right.
Interesting. So again, I think we have with some of this we're gonna have to leave to we'll leave some of this for our imagination. Suffice it to say, maybe because of the complexity of the factors we're presenting, the Gemara is comfortable leaving off at Teiku. Because let's say again, because some items will bounce, another item won't actually bounce, but like the Jello, it might not be airborne, but you'll be able to visualize the I don't know what is it, momentum or the energy and the different forces and how it's until it comes to a full and complete stop. And Dr. Hammer, that's indeed why on the plane they tell you to stay seated until it comes to a complete, what's the wording they say? Complete stop. And you always have the T's where the plane stops, and then people are about, and then they now sit down again, and then you move another few inches, and then you have gate check, or then
that's why you need a videotape to come, and you need people to look at these things and to come to a decision.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't wait teku, they have to make a decision.
And it was very interesting. Who would have thought we'd be covering all of these topics in our Gemara?
Post-football analysis.
Rabbi, getting back to the soup.
Yes.
you-
Hold on. You say what you're going to say, but I do want to transition away from the soup just because it was an analogy, so I don't want to make it into the primary. But go ahead.
Okay, so if something drops into the soup and it's more than a 60th, okay, you're over the limit. Instead of diluting it by just adding water, could you add more vegetables or whatever it is to make it thicker?
So again, this is
So
beyond
then
the-
you'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond the scope of this conversation. What I would say is like this: when a person has a specific issue with kashrus, they should always consult with competent halachic authority, because many times things that we assume are no good can actually be okay, and sometimes things we assume are okay are actually quite problematic. But diluting, it doesn't matter if it's water or soup or anything else. It's anyways. The best thing you might be able to do is if it's a chunk of something solid, you might be able to scoop the whole thing out. But anyways, let's move back to our Gemara, because I want to get to page 100 today, and we're going to do that. So Teku, it remains unresolved. Let's take a look. I'm sorry.
After all that, we end up with a teku. We don't have an answer anyway.
Well, on the contrary, Mark,
Yeah.
all of the things that we discussed now, Dr. Hammer and the plane and the jello and the 60 frame per second, that to me all explains why the Gemara leaves it as a teku. Because on one hand it happens, on the other hand this is again, this may be a total Baba Maisa. So if someone's listening in the future, this is just thinking out loud over here. But maybe that's the reason why the Gemara goes with teku instead of finding in the second way, because there isn't a clear and obvious answer, possibly. Anyways, let's see the next Gemara, and this is going to, with Hashem's help, take us over to page 100. B'sha'ah tova matzlachas. In a good time and an auspicious time. Amar Rava, new discussion. Connected, of course, related, of course, but a new subject. Pshita li, says Rava. I'll tell you, let's start off with what is clear and obvious. We've been doing a lot of questions and which have forced us to do a lot of thinking. First, let's establish what's clear. Pshita li, mayim al gabe mayim. Water being poured on top of water. Hainu hanachason. This is putting it back. Usually, a chayfetz, an item, you pick it up, you place it down. It's usually, when you're dealing with solids, it's quite clear. It's usually quite clear where that placement is happening. If you're picking it up, it's usually quite clear. Dr. Pasternak, you wanted to ask something? I see you're muted. All right, Doctor, if you want to say something, please, we'd love to hear you. So when it comes to a liquid, it's a whole lot more complicated, because it is complicated. So, but Rava says, halachically, water being poured down, that's what Rashi says. Or let's see, and if you took some out, so taking water out of water, that's picking it up, that's akira. Placing or pouring water back into water, that's the hanacha. Although, again, if we would dye the water, we would notice that it doesn't just like come to a rest. There's a lot of movement and interesting movement, and again, back to our physics. But pshitali mayim al gabe mayim hainu hanachas. Water on water, that's Water's natural habitat, water being back in its home, in it where it belongs, that's in the water. Egois al gabe mayim, but what about a nut that floats on the water? So a nut is a solid, and I guess maybe we'd say the same thing would apply to other solids that float. So what about a nut rather? Is, let's see, ding, 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 ding. We've now turned to page 100. So egois al gabe mayim, a nut on the water. Lav hainu hanachas. A nut is not considered in its resting state if it's placed onto the water.
Didn't we have this before? Or
We had
or
this.
did I look?
This was quoted earlier in the Gemara, correct?
Thought so.
Why is it not considered at rest? Right? Akira means to take it out of its resting place. Hanacha means placing it down in a resting state. So why is a nut not considered at rest? Any
You're
thoughts?
asking us?
Yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, because it does not rest in one place. It can move, because
Oh.
it floats, it moves around.
Very good. Shkoyach. So a nut doesn't stay in one place. It's constantly moving around. And therefore, to place it there, you haven't placed it down. And Rashi says, "V'im natu misham," if you took it from the water, it's also not an akira because it was never at rest. So Rava says to me, water on water, and we're going to have to do some more thinking because water also isn't really at rest, but I guess water is in its most rested. It's in the most plausibly, it's as resting as water will be. I guess we could say that, right? Water doesn't have a more restful state than water and water. But the nut, because it remains apart and it moves around, lav hainu hanachas. So that's,
So from that, so then the question comes in, if it is an object that sinks, then it would be hanacha because it does not float around.
maybe, yeah. I guess that would be the flip side of this coin. We're talking about a floating item. The Gemara didn't say so explicitly, but it's a very interesting point. Maybe something that falls to the bottom. So I guess, Dr. Stalmer, I would say, like, so a rubber ducky, is that a hanacha? Can you-
Depends on the ducky.
But
I-
but doesn't that depend on the weight of the nut? Aren't there nuts that are heavy enough to not float in water? To just go to the bottom the way a rock would?
I don't know. I guess.
Well,
guess
even
so.
if you take a coconut, which is quite large, it would float,
Yeah.
Right.
I
Interesting.
think.
Interesting. So
Actually, I don't know. Maybe not. I have no idea. I never tried it.
there was some prank. Someone showed me a video a long time ago.
Coconuts do float, unless they get really waterlogged, then they'll sink.
Now I think it's one of the things that Hashem did because the way nut trees reproduce is by their nuts. And so if a nut could float on the water, then it could reach and further populate the world with these trees. Anyways, Bai Rava, here's the question. So until now, it was what is obvious, that water is at rest. Why is water at rest if water is also constantly moving? So I want to read for you here from the Art Scroll. It says as follows. Even though the upper layer of water moves about upon a bottom layer, we view the entire body of water as one mass. Thus, even the top layer of water is viewed as being resting at the bottom. So when you take water and pour it into water, you don't have two different waters. You have a single unit of water. You have a single entity of water. And so the whole water is resting. The nut is not part of the water. I'll read more from Rabbi Dart Scroll. A nut is not considered one with water. The nut is not unified with water. It is a separate entity. Thus, since it moves about upon the water, it is not considered in a state of rest. And one who removes it from the water has not performed Akira. All right, now let's get to our question. Amar Rava, no. Why Rava? Here's the question. Egois Bikli, if you have a nut in a little dish, Vikli tzaf al gabe mayim, and now the dish is floating around. Mahu, what is the halacha? Mi amrinon, do we say basar egoy zazlinon? We look at the nut. V'hanayich, the nut is entirely stationary upon the vessel, which is not stationary. Aydilma basar kli azlinon, or do we look at the lowest support? V'haloynayich. Very interesting. You have a dish that's not stationary, but you have something that is stationarily positioned on a non-stationary item. Is that a hanacha? Is it nach or nayich? Is it resting? Is it not? And just to make things exciting, the Gemara once again says teiku, because we really need to. How do we look at this? Now I know what you're thinking. What about a? Folks, help me out. What about a boat? What are the implications of this Gemara to a boat? I don't want to go there now, but I'm sure
Usually a boat is a reshus yachid.
it's usually its own domain. So the question is, why is a boat different than a keli?
Bigger.
So
Yeah,
maybe no. Maybe it's a good question. Is what to discuss. But suffice it to say, for whatever reason, when it comes to
See, a boat, even if it's anchored, it'll still move around.
right, and so can you remove this nut? Now,
The only place that water could be still is in a quarry.
Now let's do something. Mark asked a question. Let's see if we can find this. Long ago.
Bathtub,
A bathtub.
a floating thing for a baby or kid in a bathtub.
Yeah, but a bathtub's almost always in reshus yachid though.
Yeah, okay.
That wouldn't be a problem. But
But
if it was a
a
bathtub,
quarry would be the best place.
Give me just a moment.
does it let you search?
It probably does, but the time that'll take to search is faster than just doing it manually. Almost there. Hold on, sorry. Okay. The Kurba Sefer.
Oh, this is where the book would roll down.
Yeah, remember that? Remember that long ago?
Here's
All right.
water. Might be getting close.
Oh, here. Remember, this is literally Rava's teaching in a different context. Mayim al gabe mayim, hainu hanachasan. The water placed on top of water is considered in a resting state, like we just read. Egoiz al gabe mayim, but a nut on top of water, lav hainu hanachasan. This is not the status. This is not considered at rest. By Rava, indeed, Rava asked the next question. Egoiz bikli. Bikli tzaf al gabe mayim. Vaser egoiz azlinam hanayich. Haydum vaser kli azlinam hanayich. The noyid, for he adds a word here, I think that our Gemara doesn't have. It's moving still. Teku, and the Gemara leaves off with a question.
Also take it.
What?
Also take it, but it's pretty much the same situation.
Now let's look at Tosfos here very fast. Folks, bear with me another moment, and then we're done. We say about a boat that a boat is in a resting state. And the movement of a boat is only the water. The discussion, again, we're starting a little bit of a different angle. We don't have the questions that Tosfos has. Tosfos knows the whole shas. And so Tosfos can cross-reference other Talmud. But sometimes the Tosfos, on his level of scholarship, can bring to the fore a question that we have as well. So he quotes a Gemara that talks about kinyan. Kinyan, to acquire something, sometimes a person's chatzir, a person's own property, can be kind of something. And so in the context of kinyan, the Gemara says that a svina is stationary. But when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, says the Tosfos, Hachamim Mishkan Yalfinon, V'sham lo yihaya mistama ela kederech shematzniach v'tnadam. Interesting. I don't think Tosfos answers our question here about why a boat might be considered different. Some Seifer, let's just see. Again, it's been, has it been a year since we learned this? So it's not fresh on my mind. So I'm just refreshing with you.
So can you live in a houseboat or rent a houseboat and be there Shabbos? It doesn't move. It's underwater though.
Well, if we could be there, the question is, can you go on and off of it on Shabbos?
That's another question, but that's not the only question. All right, folks. Here, this is an important issue. I owe you another a follow up. The pashtus is not considered. It is considered state. You know what? Let me leave off any further comments. I wanted to show you that in the Gemara in its source is the same thing we learned already, as Mark asked. It's phrased slightly differently. I think that this word "dinayid" is added, and the Gemara here Tosfos introduces a question about a svina. I had something I want to tell you, now I'm forgetting. I don't remember. Okay, there was something else I wanted to add, but it'll probably come to me once I hit stop share or close the share. Anyways, let's pause over here. My dear friends, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Another journey, another excursion throughout the Talmud. We did a big milestone. We're on page 100, which means that we're really 200 pages in to one of the larger Masechtas in the Talmud. Oh, whoops. Okay, I'm still learning how to navigate Safari over here. No, I just have to. There, 100. Right, you see here.
147. Isn't it 147?
I'm sorry?
Isn't it 147 the last stop? Or not?
I believe so, yeah.
2/3 of the way through, I think.
I'm sorry. Yeah, 2/3 of the way through. Yes, but it's a big deal. So, anyways, my dear friends, l'chaim, empty coffee, a toast, and a little coffee, but it's worthy, my dear friends. Hashem should give, and don't forget, because the next Gemara, just to take a look, we now talk about different fluids interacting. Until now, we're talking about a solid, water on water, a total solid. Well, yeah, those are two extremes. But what about two different types of fluids? What do two different liquids consider? And is there a distinction between different types of liquids? So that's going to be the natural continuation of our discussion over here. Again, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there will not be a shir. Friday, Mirz Hashem will resume and with the full force. And I want to thank you all. Have an enjoyable, warm yeshiva week. Enjoy the yarmulkes on the streets. When you look out of your balcony, when you walk around, it's actually, I have to admit, it's a mechaya to walk. And you just see all these wonderful Hamish people. Could be walking down the streets of Teaneck or Borough Park or Flatbush or Five Towns.
You can't get food anywhere.
But if you don't have a reservation at a restaurant, spare yourself the pain. Go to Winn-Dixie and buy some rice cakes and peanut butter. Anyways, all right, the Yashar Kayach, thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing everybody.
I bet you they put the prices up for Yeshiva Week. I went to the Grove, Boca, everything was up, ridiculous.
Well, I hate to say this, but it's what I hear is that two things are happening simultaneously. Prices are going up, period. They're not coming down after Yeshiva Week. And in addition to that, there are some shortages. I heard this from our wholesaler. But on top of all of that, we also have like the other 50% of Klal Yisrael that doesn't live in Florida currently. They're here on vacation. Yeah. And you know where the Floridians go? I spoke to my colleague in Park City, Utah, and he told me half of Hollywood, half of young Israel of Hollywood, and a few of our chevra are in Park City. So go figure. The ones in the snow want to come to the warm, and well, good for them. And the Floridians, they want to hit the slopes. So, anyways, Klal Yisrael should be safe and prosperous and well. And everyone have a wonderful day.
Yeah. And a safe travel.
Enjoy the vacation,
Ashakaya,
Any-
thank you.
mini vacation.
Thank you.